Number 1.
Eugene Wekesa has been missing since November 24, 2010. Eugene was 22 years old at the time of his disappearance, and he lived with his mother in Bellevue, Washington. He was a student at Bellevue College and was very dedicated to school. According to his mother, Eugene spent the morning of November 24 studying. It was the day before Thanksgiving, so while Eugene studied, his mother went grocery shopping at Safeway in preparation for their Thanksgiving meal. When his mother returned from shopping, Eugene was still studying. However, once his mother realized she had forgotten to get a few things, Eugene offered to go back to Safeway to get them. Surveillance cameras captured Eugene both entering and exiting the store by himself. Eugene then returned to his home, but quickly realized that he too had forgotten an item. Instead of going back to the grocery store, he opted to walk to the Crossroads Mall shopping center, which is located near his residence. Eugene never returned home and has never been seen or heard from again. Although Eugene left the house to go buy something, he left his wallet behind. He also left behind his keys and cell phone. Once Eugene was reported missing, investigators pulled surveillance footage from both the Safeway he had visited earlier that day and from the Crossroads Mall shopping center. The Safeway footage did not yield any clues about his disappearance. The footage from the Crossroads Mall never captured Eugene entering or exiting the shopping center. It appears that he never actually made it there. Eugene's disappearance is considered suspicious. According to both his loved ones, Eugene spent most of his time studying and did not socialize often. It does not appear that he planned to meet up with anyone on the day he vanished. In 2014, investigators stated that there is no evidence whatsoever to indicate foul play, but they still consider Eugene's disappearance to be suspicious. There have been no known sightings of him, and his social security, bank accounts, and social media accounts have remained inactive since he vanished. Eugene remains missing today. If you have any information that could lead to his whereabouts, please call 1-800-222-TIPS to submit an anonymous tip.
Number 2.
A California man who vanished as a teen more than a decade ago was possibly sighted attempting to hitch a ride from a retail parking lot in the suburbs of Sacramento in March. Jackson Miller has been missing since May 17, 2010, when his Honda was found abandoned near the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco. No suicide note or keys were found in the vehicle. His family said he was suffering from anxiety and depression and wasn't taking his medication when he disappeared. There was some certainty that Jackson did not jump from the bridge, but it is still unknown, the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office said in a statement on April 12. Miller was living in Cupertino at the time, and his disappearance came a month before his 20th birthday. For more than 10 years, Miller's family have agonized over his disappearance. "We've been sad and incomplete since Jackson left," his mother, Gina Funaro, told us. "There's always been a slim sliver of hope he's alive. We both always held out hope that he was out there, but honestly we flip-flopped back and forth because of the amount of time and just not being able to imagine why in the world he wouldn't call us if he was out there. That's just a huge mystery for us." Now, it seems Miller may have been spotted at a Target in Woodland, California late last month, according to authorities. On March 26, a woman told detectives she was smoking in the store's parking lot when a stranger approached her and asked for a cigarette and a ride to Sacramento. When she turned him down, however, the man requested she call him an Uber. The individual later said he was a missing person and identified himself as Jackson, according to Sacramento County Sheriff's Office. Surveillance images captured the man in question entering the Target wearing shorts. He later exited wearing black pajama pants with green shamrocks and a dark green sweater. A blue face mask partially obscured his face. An area business owner later contacted detectives, claiming a man possibly matching Jackson Miller's description had entered her store looking for a ride to Los Angeles. The man left after no one offered to help, according to Santa Rosa County detectives. Authorities, who plan to review surveillance footage from the second possible separate sighting of Miller, haven't yet publicly disclosed if the tip was viable. Detectives also interviewed an Uber driver and reviewed trip logs from the ride-sharing company in the area and at the time of the incident, which ultimately turned up no leads. The sheriff's office is aware of the missing person case of Jackson Miller. Russell Davis, a public information officer for the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office, told us in a statement. Detectives are currently in communication with the Woodland Police Department. At this time, this is still an ongoing investigation and detectives are currently using all leads to locate Mr. Miller. Funaro said she was overjoyed to learn of her son's possible sighting, but noted she was trying to remain cautiously optimistic. The best thing in the world would just be to hear him say, "Hi, Mom," and just to know he's okay, the San Jose landscape designer added. Miller's father, too, said he's hopeful the recent possible sighting was authentic. "We just really want to verify he's still alive and healthy," Paul Miller told us. "We can't understand why he would never contact us, because we were close. That's the biggest mystery." The 62-year-old marketing executive characterized the sighting as one of the biggest breaks in the case in years. "We've had different leads over the years, but this was the first one where somebody identified themselves as Jackson as a missing person," Paul Miller added. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children has since conducted a forensic cross-analysis of the target surveillance images captured last month with earlier images of Jackson Miller. The results, however, came back inconclusive, John Bischoff, vice president of the Missing Children Division, told us on Thursday. The mask worn by the man seen in the surveillance footage made it difficult to positively identify him, Miller's parents explained. They, however, stressed the person in question shares some physical traits with their missing son, particularly pointing to the man's hairline. "I was a little bit frustrated we couldn't even see his eyes straight on," Funaro said. "He has very distinctive eyes. The more and more I look at it, when I compare it to other pictures of him with his hair shaved like that and at that angle, it looks so much like him." Jackson Miller would be 30 years old if alive today. His parents described him as a very intelligent, strong-willed, gentle, and private person. He excelled in sports as a teenager, specifically swimming, as well as track and field, soccer, and wrestling, they said. Miller also suffered from anxiety and feelings of insecurity, his parents said. Shortly before his disappearance, the 19-year-old had stopped taking his prescribed medication, resulting in sleepless nights and increasingly paranoid and erratic behavior. "He went off the rails," his mother recalled. To this day, however, Jackson Miller's parents are confident their son didn't plunge to his death at the Golden Gate Bridge nearly 11 years ago. "They checked all their surveillance, nobody jumped that day," Paul Miller said. Miller's father said officials told them CCTV cameras later captured his son boarding a bus. "They can actually see the car he drove in. He then walked to a nearby bus stop. A bus came up, and he was gone out of the view of the video," Paul Miller said. Days later, further credible sightings of an individual matching Miller's description began to surface elsewhere in San Francisco, his said. "At least, it wasn't 100% that he jumped," Paul Miller stated. "And it looked like he was still in the area for a few days, and who knows what happened after that." However, the case went dormant for years, leaving the Millers in a painful limbo. "It's been very difficult," Paul Miller described. "It's unresolved, but I'd rather have hope than to know 100% that he's gone." Jackson Miller's grandmother, who is suffering from congestive heart failure, was recently transferred into hospice care in Point Pleasant, New Jersey, his parents said. His family is now praying he'll resurface in time to say goodbye. She wishes that he would call her, Funaro said. She doesn't want to die without hearing his voice again. They were very close. She was special to him. A call from him would really be very important to her. She's not ready to go yet. It's a reunion their family has visualized a million times, Funaro said. It really would be a miracle, Funaro said. If he were safe, healthy, it would just be our dream come true. Anyone with information related to Miller's whereabouts are urged to contact the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Office at 408-808-4500.
Number 3.
On Friday, May 30, 1969, Susan Davis and Elizabeth Perry, both 19, were stabbed to death by an unknown assailant near Somers Point, New Jersey. The young women had been staying in Ocean City on vacation since the Tuesday before. At 4:30 a.m. they were headed back to Pennsylvania in hopes of beating the traffic, but stopped to have breakfast at Somers Point Diner. After leaving the diner about an hour later, the sequence of events leading to their deaths is uncertain. A state trooper found their powder blue 1966 Chevrolet convertible abandoned by the parkway around noon that day and had it removed. 3 days later at about 1:30 p.m., the bodies of the two young women were found hidden under piles of leaves in dense woods, 200 yards from the Garden State Parkway and about 150 yards from the abandoned car. Davis was nude, and her clothes were found in a pile near her, including her jacket and purse. Perry was clothed, except for her underwear, which was missing. Contemporaneous news reports vary on whether the victims were sexually assaulted. Some state that Perry had not been raped, while no determination could be made for Davis. Other reports indicated that both bodies were too decomposed to make a determination, and still others said there was some evidence of sexual assault, but did not elaborate on what that was. Later news articles stated that neither woman had been raped. The coroner did find they had eaten breakfast about an hour before they were murdered and gave the time of death to be approximately 6 a.m. One of the victims had been tied to a tree with her hair, an unusual method of restraint. Both had been stabbed to death with a small knife, possibly a penknife or pocket knife, though the murder weapon was never found. Perry died of a penetrating stab wound to her right lung. She also had 3 stab wounds in her abdomen and side of her neck. Davis died of a wound in her neck that cut her larynx. She also had 4 wounds on the left side of her abdomen and a non-fatal wound on right side of her neck. Due to the neck wounds, an investigator said he theorized the killer was at some point in the backseat of the convertible, jabbing at Davis as she drove in order to force her to pull over. Police found a men's diver-style watch without a wristband near the scene, believed to belong to the murderer. The car keys were found 10 days later, tossed to the side of the road a short distance away from the bodies. Robbery was an unlikely motive as the victims' purses still had money in them, and their suitcases were not disturbed. Staff saw 2 young men dining with the victims at the Somers Point Diner, but when questioned the men swore they did not leave together and passed a polygraph test. However, one witness at the restaurant said he saw the 2 young women in a convertible picking up a young man of about 20, carrying a duffel bag and wearing a yellow sweatshirt, who appeared to be hitchhiking. The 18-year-old hitchhiker was quickly identified by police after acting suspiciously in Philadelphia and admitted to having been in Ocean City the previous week. During questioning, the young man described taking a bus to Ocean City the previous Thursday and hitchhiking back to Philadelphia Friday morning, the same time frame as the murders. He flunked a polygraph test, gave fuzzy answers to crucial questions, and made odd statements about visions he had about 2 girls driving a convertible, and I was in the back, and their hair was blowing in the wind. Despite this circumstantial evidence, Police were unable to place him at the scene, and he was ultimately released on lack of evidence. 3 young men, sleeping in their car which had run out of gas along the parkway, saw the girl's convertible about 200 feet away around 7:15 a.m. when they awakened that morning. They hadn't witnessed it park. Cleared as suspects, the teens did not report hearing any screams. 2 witnesses came forward to state they had seen a lanky, slender teenager with curly brown hair, a narrow face, and sunken cheekbones in a white t-shirt lingering near the abandoned car the morning of May 30 at about 8 a.m. However, the police cautioned, "We are not sure if this is the murderer. He was simply seen near the car." Later in the summer, a composite sketch of this suspect was released. An investigation into whether the murders were linked to similar murders targeting young women in Ann Arbor, Michigan committed by a similar-looking suspect produced no further leads, and the cases were eventually determined to be unrelated. The case went cold until a new lead surfaced in 1980 when serial killer Gerald Staino was arrested in Florida and later eventually confessed to the crime, calling it his first murder. He confessed to 41 total murders on the East Coast and often stabbed his victims without sexually assaulting them. New Jersey police sent 2 detectives down to Florida State Prison to interview him in 1982, and he signed a confession, but he had the murder taking place on the wrong side of the parkway and got all the details wrong. Detective Sergeant Robert Maholland said about the confession, "At this point, we don't believe he's our man. I'm not convinced at all." Homicide detectives said Staino often exaggerated his record of killings, thinking the resulting investigations would indefinitely delay his execution or give him more attention and better treatment. Staino later recanted his confession. He was eventually executed in Florida in 1998 for another murder. Inspired to come forward after hearing Staino had wrongly confessed to the crime, in May of 1983 a new witness surfaced who claimed to have seen a young man in a yellow sweatshirt who was definitely not Staino walking along the road in question the day of the slayings at about 6:30 a.m. When the suspect saw the witness coming, he ducked into the bushes. The witness easily picked the suspect out of a series of photographs and chose the same young hitchhiker in the yellow sweatshirt who had originally been questioned and released back in 1969. The unnamed man was living in Norristown, Pennsylvania, and worked as a long-haul truck driver. In December 1983, that unnamed suspect was again cleared when the county prosecutor's office did not move forward with charges, again citing a lack of evidence. Shortly after Bundy's execution in January 1989, forensic psychologist Art Norman contacted the New Jersey State Police claiming that Bundy had confessed the New Jersey murders to him in October of 1986. He presented them with a tape recording wherein Ted talked about his time in on the East Coast in 1969. Ted explained to Norman that around that time he was getting more into violent pornography and had been visiting the flesh shops along 42nd Street in New York City. Ted said on the 1986 tape, "Talk about being pushed to the edge with the most sophisticated, explicit pornography available in this country." Here he begins speaking in the third person. He decided to take a little bit of a jaunt to what they call the shore, the Jersey Shore. This is early summer. So, after being more or less detached from people for a long period, didn't have any friends, didn't really go anywhere, just more or less had school, and then sort of entertained himself with his pornographic hobby, and drove the shore, and watched the beach, and just saw young women lying on the beach. You know, it's like an overwhelming kind of vision. He evidently found himself tearing around that place for a couple of days. And eventually, without really planning anything, he picked up a couple of young girls. And ended up with the first time he had ever done it. So when he left for the coast, it was not just getting away, it was more like an escape. Norman said neither woman was sexually assaulted, unlike subsequent Bundy victims, because he was overwhelmed by the magnitude of the crime. It was quite a wild scene. That's why it was very important, because it was a start. Whether Norman inferred this or Bundy directly stated it is unclear. I'm convinced he did it, Norman said. And I believe that it was the first two murders that he got into. He had no reason to lie to me, and if he was lying, he had been saving this information for 20 years just to con somebody. Or is this just an amazing coincidence that he just happened to be there on Memorial Day before he went back to the West Coast and two girls disappeared in that area at the time? That is an amazing coincidence then, and I don't think he had a little book of crimes that he knew about that he could use to throw his psychologist off. Everything else he told me has been borne out, so why should he lie just about that? I believe him. It's important to note here that Bundy was incarcerated with Gerald Staino on Florida State Prison's death row at the same time as when police were questioning Staino about this crime. In The Riverman, Ted Bundy and I Hunt for the Green River Killer by Robert Keppel, Bundy explains that he was able to read some of the Staino's confession documents. I last was with Jerry, we were both on death watch, as a matter of fact, together, and we also lived in the same wing together for some time, and I read a very confidential report, a presentence report prepared by some state agency. It went into great detail about his confessions and his past life, and so getting to know Jerry was fascinating, cause he'd tell me stories about things that happened, and then I'd read that something else had happened in the police report. The case went cold until a new lead surfaced in 1980 when serial killer Gerald Staino was arrested in Florida and later eventually confessed to the crime, calling it his first murder. He confessed to 41 total murders on the East Coast and often stabbed his victims without sexually assaulting them. New Jersey police sent two detectives down to Florida State Prison to interview him in 1982, and he signed a confession, but he had the murder taking place on the wrong side of the parkway and got all the details wrong. Detective Sergeant Robert Maholland said about the confession, "At this point, we don't believe he's our man. I'm not convinced at all." Homicide detectives said Staino often exaggerated his record of killings, thinking the resulting investigations would indefinitely delay his execution or give him more attention and better treatment. Staino later recanted his confession. He was eventually executed in Florida in 1998 for another murder. Inspired to come forward after hearing Staino had wrongly confessed to the crime, in May of 1983 a new witness surfaced who claimed to have seen a young man in a yellow sweatshirt who was definitely not Staino walking along the road in question the day of the slayings at about 6:30 a.m. When the suspect saw the witness coming, he ducked into the bushes. The witness easily picked the suspect out of a series of photographs and chose the same young hitchhiker in the yellow sweatshirt who had originally been questioned and released back in 1969. The unnamed man was living in Norristown, Pennsylvania, and worked as a long-haul truck driver. In December 1983, that unnamed suspect was again cleared when the county prosecutor's office did not move forward with charges, again citing a lack of evidence. Shortly after Bundy's execution in January 1989, forensic psychologist Art Norman contacted the New Jersey State Police claiming that Bundy had confessed the New Jersey murders to him in October of 1986. He presented them with a tape recording wherein Ted talked about his time in on the East Coast in 1969. Ted explained to Norman that around that time he was getting more into violent pornography and had been visiting the flesh shops along 42nd Street in New York City. Ted said on the 1986 tape, "Talk about being pushed to the edge with the most sophisticated, explicit pornography available in this country." Here he begins speaking in the third person. He decided to take a little bit of a jaunt to what they call the shore, the Jersey Shore. This is early summer. So, after being more or less detached from people for a long period, didn't have any friends, didn't really go anywhere, just more or less had school, and then sort of entertained himself with his pornographic hobby, and drove the shore, and watched the beach, and just saw young women lying on the beach. You know, it's like an overwhelming kind of vision. He evidently found himself tearing around that place for a couple of days. And eventually, without really planning anything, he picked up a couple of young girls. And ended up with the first time he had ever done it. So when he left for the coast, it was not just getting away, it was more like an escape. Norman said neither woman was sexually assaulted, unlike subsequent Bundy victims, because he was overwhelmed by the magnitude of the crime. It was quite a wild scene, that's why it was very important, because it was a start. Whether Norman inferred this, or Bundy directly stated it, is unclear. I'm convinced he did it, Norman said. And I believe that it was the first two murders that he got into. He had no reason to lie to me, and if he was lying, he had been saving this information for 20 years just to con somebody. Or is this just an amazing coincidence that he just happened to be there on Memorial Day before he went back to the West Coast, and two girls disappeared in that area at the time? That is an amazing coincidence then, and I don't think he had a little book of crimes that he knew about that he could use to throw his psychologist off. Everything else he told me has been borne out, so why should he lie just about that? I believe him. It's important to note here that Bundy was incarcerated with Gerald Staino on Florida State Prison's death row at the same time as when police were questioning Staino about this crime. In The Riverman, Ted Bundy and I Hunt for the Green River Killer by Robert Keppel, Bundy explains that he was able to read some of the Staino's confession documents. I last was with Jerry, we were both on death watch, as a matter of fact, together, and we also lived in the same wing together for some time, and I read a very confidential report, a presentence report prepared by some state agency. It went into great detail about his confessions and his past life, and so getting to know Jerry was fascinating, cause he'd tell me stories about things that happened, and then I'd read that something else had happened in the police report. Attorney Polly Nelson said that Norman had spoken to Bundy at a time when he talked about himself in the third person, exaggerated what he had done, and threw in purposefully misleading details. He repeated the story of his East Coast trip to psychiatrist Dr. Dorothy Lewis the day before his execution, this time with major differences. He claimed that he had visited Ocean City in the spring of 1969 and had attempted to abduct a woman there but was unsuccessful. As recorded in Nelson's Defending the Devil, Bundy said, "Well, later on that same year, in the spring, I went to Ocean City. And just hanging out at the beach and looking at the young women, trailing them around. And my plan again was I had never done anything like this before. I was compelled to act out this vision. Okay, so I was just stalking around the downtown area of this small resort community and I saw a young woman walking along. I didn't actually kill someone this time, but I really, for the first time, approached a victim, spoke to her, tried to abduct her, and she escaped. But that was the kind of step that I couldn't ever return from. In Ocean City, I realized just how inept I was. And so that made me more cautious, and so I didn't do that again for a long time." While making his final confession on the morning of the execution, the warden specifically asked Bundy if he had ever committed murder in New Jersey. "No, nothing," he responded. The serial killer was electrocuted minutes later. Investigator Major Thomas Kinzer, one of the original detectives on the murders, said that two New Jersey detectives tried to interview Ted in 1988 about the crime, but he would not discuss the case. "There was never enough evidence to be sure that he did it," said Kinzer. The Atlantic County Prosecutor's Office called Norman's report inconclusive. It was not viewed as substantial enough evidence to be included at the FBI conference in 1989, where police and the FBI re-examined a number of unsolved crimes in light of Bundy's last-minute confessions. A spokesman for the New Jersey State Police said that the meetings were limited to law enforcement officials who had strong evidence linking Bundy to certain crimes. Bundy was enrolled at Temple University in Philadelphia from January to May 1969. He returned to the West Coast sometime in May, staying with friends in San Francisco and visiting his ex-girlfriend Diane Edwards for a few weeks before returning to Washington state and renting a room in the Rogers boarding house, but sources are unclear on the exact dates for these movements. Kinzer said he did find Ted's Aunt Audrey in Philadelphia, who told him that her nephew could not have gone to the Jersey Shore that weekend because he had been in an auto accident and had a cast on his leg. No record of such an accident was found. Bingo, said Richard Larson, Seattle Times editor and author of The Deliberate Stranger, who interviewed Bundy extensively. Larson believed Ted made the trip to New York City and Ocean City in a car borrowed from a university faculty member and said this leg cast fit in perfectly with Bundy's MO, using an injury ruse to lure victims. Larson said the killings were Bundy's first adult, planned crimes. He believes that when the two young women drove out of Ocean City before dawn that day, they were headed into a trap laid by the 22-year-old Bundy, who had stalked them on the beach and was waiting on the parkway, pretending to be injured with a leg cast to get them to stop. Larson shared his suspicions with Perry's parents, whom he had befriended after their move to Washington state. The victim's mother, Margaret Perry, later said, "We are convinced that when Ted Bundy died, our daughter's killer got his comeuppance." Without psychologist Art Norman's testimony, a Bundy connection to this case would probably never have been considered. The East Coast was not his usual hunting grounds. The timing of the crime predates his earliest known attacks by at least 4 years. The type of attack, stabbing, and the lack of any sexual assault were also not typical for Bundy, who generally preferred to bludgeon his victims into unconsciousness before strangling them to death while raping them. However, it was the serial killer's own pseudo-confession to the killings in 1986 which brought renewed attention to the cold case when revealed by Norman immediately after his execution in 1989. While it does seem unusual for Bundy to have had such specific details about this case, if he was innocent, the location, the time of year, the two victims, there is a simple explanation for how he could have known this: fellow death row inmate Gerald Steno. Bundy described his relationship with Steno at length to Keppel, even specifically stating that he had read Steno's confidential reports which detailed his confessions. Since Steno had already confessed to the Perry Davis double murder, Bundy could have easily gathered the basic details just by reading these reports. Bundy may have been amused by the coincidence as he himself had also visited the Jersey Shore that year and decided to play a game with Norman, as he seemed to enjoy doing with anyone who tried to compel a confession from him. Norman asserts that Bundy had no reason to lie, but in this case, his third-person confession may have truly been about a third person after all: Gerald Steno. Bundy did not fully come clean about his own crimes until several years later, in the days leading up to his execution. So far, none of the murders he was accused of and denied in his final days have been definitively linked to him, and he specifically denied ever committing any murders in New Jersey in his last moments. As of today, all indications point to his final confessions, and especially his denials being truthful. The more accurate story seems to be in his final interview with psychiatrist Dr. Dorothy Lewis, when he talks about his visit to the shore in the spring of 1969, not the summer. In this version, he never mentions anything about two victims at once, but says he followed a young woman and attempted to abduct her, but she escaped. Bundy repeatedly denied any assaults or murders, even any attempted ones, before this failed kidnapping in New Jersey. He claimed his first murder, possibly of a hitchhiker, did not occur until about 1972 or 1973 in Washington. This is more in line with what we know about his development as a killer. Bundy described to Dr. Lewis how his deviance began slowly, beginning with violent sexual fantasies, which incrementally increased to stalking and peeping, then attempted half-baked assaults and kidnappings, such as this one, which he claimed was his earliest. It took several years of this conditioning and experimentation before he committed his first murder. After this botched kidnapping attempt in 1969, he realized he needed to better plan his attacks for them to be successful and became more methodical and cautious. However, even his other early attacks, including a pseudo-confession about hitting a woman in the head with a piece of wood, stalking a woman and attempting to suffocate her with a pillow in her bed, and his first murder, committed on impulse, show his lack of experience prior to his first confirmed murders in 1974. During a teary phone call with his ex-girlfriend Liz Klopfer after his 1978 arrest in Florida, a despondent and vulnerable Bundy indicated a similar personal history, saying, "I've fought it for a long time, it got too strong. We just happened to be going together when it got underway." As he began dating Liz in the fall of 1969, this timeline makes sense. He had already attempted to act out his sexually violent fantasies earlier that same year, and his urges would only get stronger during their relationship. Larson makes a lot out of Aunt Audie's assertion that Bundy had a cast on his leg during Memorial Day weekend in 1969 and that there was no record of an auto accident. He then jumps to the conclusion that therefore Bundy must have been using a leg cast ruse to lure the victims into picking him up. Several issues with this line of reasoning come to mind. First, Aunt Audie, his mother Louise's sister, may have been mistaken on the timeline, since by the time she was asked, Memorial Day weekend of 1969 was 20 years prior. Second, even if her memory was in fact accurate, just because there was no record of an auto accident doesn't mean one did not occur. Third, Bundy did in fact break his ankle before meeting Liz in the early fall of 1969. She described his ankle injury to the Seattle police, said he had been in continuing consultation with a doctor about it, and that it prevented his draft into the Vietnam War. A timeline of his movements compiled by the Seattle police in 1975 lists a broken right ankle occurring in Philadelphia in 1969. Bundy's broken ankle is again corroborated by the presentencing report compiled by Utah investigators in 1976. The report goes on to say that as a result of his injury, Bundy was classified as 4F, not acceptable for service due to medical, dental, or other reasons, by the military. The FBI multi-agency timeline, compiled in 1992, also lists several dates for when he visited a Seattle clinic regarding the injury. Obviously, Bundy did hurt his leg in Philadelphia sometime during the first half of 1969, but I was unable to verify exactly how or when it happened. Aunt Audrey could easily have meant this injury in her statement. Besides the fact that the cast was likely genuine, Bundy was not known to wear his ruse implements, cast, sling, crutches, around anyone but his victims. None of his co-workers, friends, or girlfriend never mentioned seeing him in them, so it seems unlikely that he would have worn a false leg cast around his aunt. The timing in this case is important. The crime occurred on Memorial Day weekend in 1969, the last weekend in May. In her interviews with Seattle police, ex-girlfriend Diane Edwards claimed that Bundy had surprised her, showing up unexpectedly in San Francisco in the spring of 1969. She had moved there in March of that year. If Diane was accurately remembering the time of year, Bundy could be placed across the country in San Francisco before the beginning of summer, which traditionally kicks off after Memorial Day weekend. In addition, Bundy's diagnostic study report, created to investigate his background prior to sentencing in the Carol Daringe kidnapping case, states, in May of 1969, Following Theodore's experience at Temple University, he traveled to San Francisco, California, stayed there for approximately 2 to 3 weeks with friends, then he moved to Tacoma, Washington. This also would place him on the opposite side of the country before the last day of May, when the murders took place. There is no evidence which places Bundy in New Jersey on Memorial Day weekend, and at least 2 separate pieces of information which place him in California at the time. Aside from the final murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach, who may or may not have had her throat cut, Bundy never actively used a knife in his attacks. None of the discovered bodies or bones attributed to Bundy ever had any apparent stab wounds. He also never confessed to using a knife on any of his victims, though he did say he used a hacksaw to decapitate Georgianne Hawkins post-mortem. To the contrary, in his confessions to FBI agent Bill Hagmaier, Bundy spoke about how he preferred strangling incapacitated women, watching their last breath, and the godlike power it lent him. The killer also said that his first victim was manually strangled with his bare hands, but found that too difficult, later switching to a garrote. Therefore, the MO of this stabbing homicide makes little sense when compared with Bundy's usual method, especially if we are to believe it was his very first murder. Another major departure from Bundy's typical MO in this case is the lack of any solid evidence of sexual assault, although one could argue that the victim's state of undress could indicate some form of sexual molestation. Violence featured heavily in Bundy's sexual gratification, as he often emphasized in his final days when attempting to answer the why question of what he did. Arguably, the excitement or stimulation associated with the sexual aspect of murder were Bundy's main motivations in committing his crimes. Nearly all of his assaults and murders involved some form of rape, whether by proxy, using an object, or in the traditional sense of the term. In the few instances where he did not sexually assault his victims, it seems that circumstances and timing simply did not permit him to do so, such as the attacks on Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler at the Chi Omega sorority house and Cheryl Thomas later that night. When examining the pool of confirmed Bundy victims, it seems to me that, if he had the time and opportunity, he would always rape before killing, as that factored so heavily into his violent sexual fantasies. Yet, as in the 1966 case of Lonnie Trumbull and Lisa Wick, despite having hours to spend with the victims before they were found, this killer did not sexually assault them. Perry and Davis were not found until 3 full days after their murder. Perhaps their murderer simply enjoyed the threat of sexual assault and the fear it engendered more than the act itself. Or maybe he was scared off by something unknown after the victims began to undress, but before the rape could take place, and decided to quickly kill them instead. Davis's clothes found in a neat pile indicate that she removed them herself while under duress. By all indications, Perry's underwear were simply missing from the crime scene, implying that the killer took them with him as a trophy or masturbation aid. Bundy generally did not keep the personal items of his victims, but preferred to discard them as soon as possible. In my mind, the best suspect in this case is neither Bundy nor Stano, but rather the young hitchhiker in the yellow sweatshirt who was spotted climbing into the back of the women's convertible and later walking along the same stretch of highway. His fuzzy statements to police in 1969 and again in 1983 about riding in the back of a convertible with 2 young women are strange. Combined with his suspicious behavior around the time of the crime, the unnamed Pennsylvania man seems the most likely suspect, but I'll admit the evidence is still largely circumstantial. During my research, I never saw mention of unknown fingerprints found in the car, though it's quite possible any potential evidence was destroyed when the car was towed to an impound lot the day of the murder. Without a sexual assault, DNA evidence is probably non-existent.
Number 4.
Nikki Lyn Forrest, 19, was 4.5 months pregnant when she vanished on September 25, 2010. The young woman had been living with her godmother in Piqua, Ohio prior to her disappearance. The day she vanished, Nikki and her godmother got into an argument that resulted in Nikki packing her bags and leaving. She then went to her boyfriend's house in Troy, Ohio, located approximately 8 miles away from Piqua. This man was also rumored to be the father of Nikki's unborn baby. Nikki's boyfriend later said that he got into an argument with her over her child's paternity. He allegedly placed her suitcase outside on the front porch, kicking her out of the house. A few minutes later, the boyfriend said that a blue car pulled up in front of his house and that Nikki got inside the car and drove off. She has never been seen or heard from again. A few days later, an elderly couple found Nikki's purse on a bridge off of County Road 25A, in between Troy and Piqua. The couple brought the purse to a local Kroger's grocery store and left without telling the clerk their names. Nikki's loved ones were incredibly worried after the discovery of her purse, especially because Nikki's medication was found inside of it. Nikki had previously miscarried 3 different times, so she was given medication during this pregnancy because she was considered at risk. Authorities have never been able to identify the couple that found the purse, but they have stated that they want to speak with them and are requesting for them to come forward. Nikki's boyfriend has still not been publicly identified, but in 2017 authorities announced that they decided to dig up his property after cadaver dogs tracked the scent of human remains in his backyard. Investigators have not revealed what they found at the search, but it has been reported that 2 pieces of significant evidence were located. At this time, Nikki remains missing, and there have otherwise been very few updates on her case. There are also no public records of her ever giving birth to her child. If you have any information on the disappearance of Nikki Lyn Forrest, please contact the Piqua Police Department 937-778-2027.
Number 5.
Tameka Anderson, 25, has been missing since February 23, 2010. The mother of 2 was last seen in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, at the Telco Federal Credit Union. Tameka went there to withdraw money from the ATM, which she planned to use to buy a car. After leaving the credit union, Tameka called multiple family members to tell them that she was headed to Galvez, Louisiana with an acquaintance to buy the vehicle. The car was never purchased, and Tameka never returned home. She has never been seen or heard from again. The acquaintance Tameka was with that day has not been publicly identified. It appears that Tameka's family is unaware of that person's identity. However, they do believe that this person had something to do with Tameka's disappearance. In fact, Tameka's aunt told reporters that she does not believe the acquaintance had any intentions of helping Tameka buy a car. The aunt explained, "I believe it was a setup. They knew she got her income tax. She told them how much money she had." Still, investigators stated that they were unable to find any evidence of foul play, and news about Tameka's case seemed to fade as the months and the years passed. Over time, Tameka's family members grew frustrated with the lack of support from their community. Tameka's brother believes that people in their community are sticking to street code, which means they refrain from speaking up or getting involved in the bad things they witness. Tameka's brother attributes this to the rate of unsolved crimes in the Baton Rouge area. All of Tameka's family members believe that someone has more information about Tameka's disappearance that they are not sharing. Tameka's aunt told reporters, "Someone saw something that morning. Someone saw Tameka get into a car as she left her house that morning. But nobody is talking." Tameka's family members remain resilient in their search for Tameka. As part of their efforts, they are hoping to end the silence in their community as well. Tameka's uncle stated, "With the silence in the communities, the abductions, shootings and robberies, we'll never have a better community if we don't communicate with each other. For more information on this important issue, please visit this resource. Additionally, if you have any information about Tameka Anderson's whereabouts, please contact the Baton Rouge Police Department at 914-737-7171.
Number 6.
Many of us remember our college days, where we would travel off campus for a little fun at a house party. On December 3, 2010, Tyler Marie Thomas did just that. The 19-year-old Peru State College student left a party and made her way back to her dorm room. Tyler was spotted on her short journey walking near the Peru, Nebraska town's water tower, which was only a few hundred feet from her destination. Somehow, she disappeared before entering the building. That evening at the party, Tyler was reportedly drinking quite a bit of alcohol. She was observed downing multiple beers and a number of shots. Immediately before she disappeared, Tyler sent her friend a text message that stated that she didn't know where she was, even though she was seen by witnesses not far from her building. At 3 a.m., just an hour and a half after someone saw her, Tyler was reported missing. It was a frightfully cold night with the temperature falling to the teens and Tyler was walking the streets without a coat. It didn't take long to name Joshua Keetle, another Peru student, as a suspect in Tyler's disappearance. At one time they'd gone on a date, but Tyler decided she really didn't like Keetle, a junior sports management major. She told friends that she was trying to actively avoid him. Within days of Tyler's disappearance, Keetle was arrested on separate charges of felony rape and false imprisonment. Another woman contacted police and told them that Keetle sexually assaulted her on Halloween Day 3 times, just a month before Tyler vanished. Keetle was also charged with evidence tampering and providing false information in relation to Tyler's case. Keetle's story doesn't end there. Another young woman bravely told police that 2 years prior in April 2008, when she was just 15 years old, Keetle raped her. She claimed that when she visited a friend at Midland Lutheran College, now known as Midland University, Keetle assaulted her when she was staying overnight on campus and he was enrolled as a student there. Keetle also faced charges of indecent exposure over accusations that he showed his genitals to a woman just months before Tyler went missing. When questioned by police about Tyler, the South Carolina native initially said that he did see Tyler walking along the road the night she disappeared, but he never stopped to speak to her. Keetle's story changed, however, and he later stated that Tyler got into his car and he drove to a dock on the Missouri River so they could smoke marijuana. According to Keetle, Tyler told him that she would perform some sort of sexual act on him in exchange for a ride, but after the sexual act was completed, he said Tyler accused him of raping her. Keetle said that Tyler threw her cell phone at him before they engaged in a verbal argument that turned physical. He said that he left her there on the dock, alone around 2 a.m., and then went back to his dorm to take a shower. Coincidentally, the dock was the same place where the previous alleged Halloween rape began. Following up on Keetle's second story of events, investigators found both tire tracks matching Keetle's vehicle and drag marks, as if a body had been moved to the river. Peru State College was aware that Keetle needed to be removed from campus. In the week of Tyler's disappearance, the director of campus security recommended to the college and Keetle be formally kicked out. There were criminal charges from him kicking in the door of his dorm room. There were accusations of sexual harassment. He was failing his classes, and security was aware of his previous rape accusations from Midland. Instead, the administration at the college opted to let him complete the semester before expulsion. 2 years after Tyler vanished, Keetle was convicted of the 2008 rape and sentenced to 15 to 20 years. What's terrifying is this serial rapist became eligible for parole this year. Tyler's family sued Peru College and Keetle for the wrongful death of the young college student, as they believe Keetle murdered her. In 2015, a judge dismissed their suit against the college, stating that there was no way the institution could have foreseen that he was a risk for violent behavior. The suit against Keatle, however, was ruled in favor of the family and awarded them $2.64 billion in damages. As Keatle is in jail and doesn't have any money or assets, it's unlikely any money will be paid out. 7 years after Tyler disappeared, Keatle was charged with the first-degree murder of Tyler Marie Thomas. That trial is still pending. A man named Corey Pfeiffer said that in 2011, he was serving a 30-day sentence in the same jail where Keatle was being housed. According to Pfeiffer, Keatle admitted that he killed Tyler. Josh Keatle told him he had taken Tyler Thomas down to the river and they had sex, and they would never convict him because they would never find her body. Investigator Carrie Crosby testified Thursday during a preliminary hearing in Nemaha County District Court. Tyler's body has yet to be found. Keatle had pleaded not guilty to the first-degree murder charges. At the time of her disappearance, Tyler was 5 feet 5 inches tall and weighed 140 pounds. She has black dark brown hair, brown eyes, and piercings in her lip and eyebrow. Her nickname is Ty. Anyone with information about this case is urged to contact the Nemaha County Sheriff's Office at 402-274-3139. If you or anyone you know is a victim of rape and in need of help or resources, please call RAIN, Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network at 800.656.HOPE 4673. Please share this story about Tyler Marie Thomas to continue the conversation about her disappearance and to help bring her home. She is our sister and her life matters.
Number 7.
It's been 11 years since a Washington, D.C. mom of 2 watched a movie with her children and put them to bed before mysteriously vanishing from their home. The next morning, the boys, who were 4 and 5 at the time, and a 10-year-old cousin woke up to find the apartment in disarray and no sign of their mother, 24-year-old Unique Harris, according to local station WTTG. For years, the baffling crime remained unsolved, but on Saturday, members of the Capital Area Regional Fugitive Task Force arrested 43-year-old Isaac Moya for second-degree murder while armed in Harris's death, according to a statement from the Metropolitan Police Department. Moya had been interviewed multiple times during the investigation, and a GPS monitor he had been wearing at the time confirmed he had been at Harris's apartment building the night she disappeared, according to court records obtained by the local station. The records continuously indicate that he was present at that location throughout the night, the affidavit said. Authorities said the records showed that Moya, who goes by the nickname Iceberg, left the apartment building at 7:20 a.m. on Oct.10 and walked back to a wooded area near his home. In 2017, Harris's then 5-year-old son also placed him at the scene, telling a new detective assigned to the case that he thought he had seen Iceberg at the apartment that night, according to court records. He told police he had heard arguing and a muffled scream. Also in 2017, investigators were able to find Moya's DNA on a couch cushion that had been in Harris's apartment, according to the affidavit. 3 years later, in 2020, a witness in custody told investigators that Moya had mentioned a missing girl to him, but allegedly said that they will never get him because he did it the right way, so they will never figure it out. Kristen Metzger, deputy director of the Office of Communications for the department, told Oxygen.com that Harris's body has never been recovered. She declined to release any further details of the case, citing the active and ongoing investigation. Police said that a D.C. Superior Court agreed to issue Harris a death certificate in 2018 after efforts to locate the missing person were unsuccessful. Those who knew Harris, including her 2 sons, are grateful that after a decade, there's been an arrest in the case. "The boys haven't had any closure," the boys' paternal grandmother Laurette Turner told local station WWBT. "They were so young. They had forgotten a lot, but they didn't have closure to what had possibly happened to her." Turner, who helped raise the boys with her son after Harris's death, described Moya's arrest as justice for those who knew her. "It's been a long, hard road," she said. Harris's mother, Valencia Harris, said in a series of posts on Facebook that she had been overwhelmed in the days since Moya's arrest. In the years since her daughter disappeared, Valencia Harris became an advocate for the missing, exploited and victims of domestic violence. "I hope and pray every parent out here can rest a little bit easier now that this deviant, diabolical vulture is off the damn streets. My child's life and passing will not be in vain," she wrote. Metzger said anyone with information about the case is urged to call police at 202-727-9099 or text 50411.